A new direction. Mexico elects a leftist candidate as its next president. A landslide victory. What it means for the U.S. Supreme Court update. The role Roe v. Wade will play in the debate for the opening on the nation's highest court. Message of peace. What Pope Francis says about anti-government violence in Nicaragua and what the church can do to stop it. And something to chew on. Pope Francis makes a surprise appearance at a dinner on EWTN News Nightly for Monday, July 2nd, 2018. Good evening from Washington. Thanks for joining us for News from a Catholic Perspective. I'm Jason Calvi, in for Lauren Ashburn. Catholic bishops visit the U.S. Mexico border to talk about immigration. Thousands of migrant children were separated from their parents after the president's zero-tolerance policy went into effect in April. White House correspondent Mark Irons is following the fallout to the policy. Good evening, Mark.
Good evening, Jason. After public backlash to zero tolerance, President Trump took executive action to allow migrant families to remain together when they are detained at the border. The bishops visiting Brownsville, Texas tonight are still concerned, even as migrant families are slowly being reunited. A mother finally able to embrace her 12-year-old daughter again. They were separated for nearly a month after fleeing violence in Guatemala. But confusion continues on the border after more than 2,000 children were separated from parents who were prosecuted for crossing the border illegally. The Trump administration says the families are being reunited as quickly as possible, but border laws must continue to be enforced.
We have unbelievably bad border laws, immigration laws, the weakest in the world, laughed at by everybody in the world.
According to the White House, 500,000 illegal immigrants' families and minors from Central America have been released into the United States since 2014 as a result of catch-and-release loopholes. Still, Archbishop Gustavo Garcia Sierra of San Antonio is critical of anyone who is cooperating in what he calls the evil of separations.
Is immoral, is evil, and is a sin to treat families that way. And that doesn't matter who is doing it.
Over the weekend, protesters across the country loudly agreed.
No fear! Immigrants are welcome here!
Some Democrats in Congress have even called for an end to ICE, U.S. Customs and Border Enforcement. President Trump shot them down on Twitter. He wrote, "The liberal left, also known as the Democrats, want to get rid of ICE, who do a fantastic job, and want open borders. Crime would be rampant and uncontrollable. Make America great again." Homeland Security is also using Twitter to praise ICE. The department promises to share, quote, stories of the brave men and women who put their lives on the line every day with the sole objective of protecting our nation. We will be hearing more from the bishop's delegation on the border. They are holding a press conference this evening. Jason?
All right, White House correspondent Mark Irons, thanks so much. And President Trump congratulates the new president-elect of Mexico. And he says he's looking forward to working with him. It was a historic election. Mexican citizens voted for a leftist firebrand who promises to govern for the poor. Correspondent Wyatt Goolsby reports.
The new president-elect of Mexico, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, holding a victory rally in Mexico City's main square.
Y no les voy a fallar.
López Obrador, also called AMLO, saying, "I won't fail you," and he will apply 3 principles: do not lie, do not steal, and do not betray the people. The 64-year-old leftist captured more than 53% of the vote in Sunday's election, the largest margin in nearly 2 decades. In his victory speech, he said he's willing to work with the United States.
Estados Unidos.
The anti-establishment candidate is standing up for Mexicans who honorably work in the U.S. He says relations must be based on mutual respect. President Trump says he and López Obrador had a half-hour phone conversation earlier today.
He had a very excellent election, did, I would say, even better than anticipated. I told him a number of years ago when I saw him campaigning for a different race, frankly, a different year, a different race, I said someday he's going to be the president of Mexico.
It's a different tone than the one President Trump has with Mexico's current president, Enrique Peña Nieto. In February, Peña Nieto called off a trip to Washington after the president insisted that Mexico should pay for construction of a border wall. The two have also butted heads over the issue of Mexican immigration into the U.S. Mexico's new president will have to address those topics and others like corruption and drug violence. More than a dozen Catholic priests have been killed in the past 6 years. López Obrador has talked about faith and values in a country where 80% of the population is Catholic, but he's often dodged key questions on social issues like whether he's for or against same-sex marriage and abortion. Wyatt Goolsby, EWTN News Nightly.
President Trump says he spoke this morning with 4 possible Supreme Court picks. He said he'll meet with 2 to 3 more before revealing his nominee next Monday. He promises he won't ask candidates for their views on Roe versus Wade. But senators who will confirm that nominee are sure talking a lot about that 1973 abortion case.
Congratulations.
She voted to confirm Justice Neil Gorsuch.
I want a judge who will apply the law to the facts of the case with fidelity to the Constitution.
But Republican Senator Susan Collins is after more than just fidelity. She says she wants the next Supreme Court nominee to uphold precedent, especially when it comes to abortion.
I would not support a nominee who demonstrated hostility to Roe v. Wade, because that would mean to me that their judicial philosophy did not include a respect for established decisions, established law.
Collins and fellow Republican Lisa Murkowski of Alaska each support abortion. Of 51 Republican senators, there are 2 who may vote against the president's high court choice. With Senator John McCain sick at home, Republicans could fall short of the majority needed to confirm a new justice. Democrats say the confirmation process should wait until after midterm elections, when they'll have the chance to reclaim the majority. Either way, Justice Anthony Kennedy's legacy hangs in the balance.
You will see many Kennedy decisions go down, I think, in the coming years. Trump was not talking about replacing a Kennedy with a Kennedy, and anyone who thinks that that's a possibility doesn't know this president.
Senate Democratic leader Chuck Schumer tweets against one name on the president's list, Catholic appeals judge Amy Barrett. Schumer labels her an activist judge, and if she makes it to the high court, he says she'd be the deciding vote to overturn Roe v. Wade. Joining me to talk more about the Supreme Court is Matthew Continetti, editor of the Washington Free Beacon. What do you make of Schumer's comments here about Judge Amy Barrett?
Well, I think Schumer's tweets may have been directed at an audience of one, and that is Senator Collins, whose vote is so important to the confirmation of President Trump's pick. I also think there's a chance that Senator Schumer may be trying to goad President Trump into nominating Judge Barrett, who he thinks has a higher chance of being opposed by Senators Collins and Murkowski.
Because she is on the record on Roe v. Wade, right?
That's right. That's right. And even though she got through to the appeals court last year, her nomination encountered ferocious criticism from Democrats like Dianne Feinstein, which was really almost indeed stepped over the line into simple anti-Catholic bigotry. Nominating Barrett, I think, would be President Trump's way of throwing a grenade into the 2018 midterm election cycle. And of course, President Trump does like to disrupt things.
What does this nomination, if it was Amy Barrett or any of the other ones, what does this say about the 2018 elections, where you've got 10 Democrats up for re-election in states that President Trump won?
That's right. Well, you know, as much as we're talking about Senators Collins and Murkowski, the real party that Supreme Court nominations divides is the Democratic Party. And that is because, precisely as you say, there are many Democrats from red states who voted for Donald Trump in the election. And of course, one of the reasons Donald Trump won the 2016 election was his promise to nominate originalist or strict constructionist judges who refer always to the Constitution in their decisions. So a lot of these senators who are up for re-election on the Democratic side are going to be put in a vise. I look especially at Senator Claire McCaskill from Missouri. She's already in a tough race against the AG there, Josh Hawley. And she's now going to be put in a place where voting against President Trump's nominee will be very unpopular with a lot of rural Missourians.
So that's obviously what we're looking at. But we also see the White House having outreach. They met with the 3 Democrats who voted for Neil Gorsuch, including Joe Manchin of West Virginia. Do you think that outreach will continue?
It depends on how successful Schumer is in rallying his caucus. I think it also depends a lot on who President Trump nominates. If they nominate someone like a Brett Kavanaugh, who's probably kind understood to be the safer pick in a way. It might be possible to get some of those Democratic votes, like with Justice Gorsuch, to vote in support. If it's a controversial nominee, someone like Judge Barrett, I think Schumer might have an easier time. And remember, Schumer has all of the Democratic liberal groups as well, pressuring those red state Democrats to vote against the judge, and perhaps endangering their re-election chances.
Republicans have a 51-seat, they have 51 senators. That's just the number needed to get one of these judges confirmed. What do you do with Susan Collins? What does the president do to get her on board?
Well, I think you nominate someone like Justice Gorsuch, right, who she supported. And of course, he is a judge who has a more originalist philosophy about the Constitution, who refers back to the American founding, and who is understood to be, more open to restrictions on the practice of abortion. A judge like that is probably going to get Senator Collins. But of course, remember, there's a 51-seat majority, but there's only 50 Republican senators because John McCain is in Arizona. So that makes this fight even more on a razor's edge.
And you've got the vice president who can cast a tiebreaker here if needed. Going back to Susan Collins of Maine's Republican, she says she will not support a nominee who demonstrates hostility to Roe v. Wade. So again, how does that play out with what she's now saying to the president right now?
Well, I think what you have is a lot of people in the White House counsel's office pouring through not only the judicial opinions written by the prospective nominees, but also as far back as, say, their college op-eds, right, to see whether they're on record, even in any piece of writing, demonstrating what Collins called hostility toward Roe v. Wade. What the White House wants is a nominee who will be very hard to pin down on the Roe question, which means that the fight will really be over judicial philosophy. And if the fight's over judicial philosophy, the White House wins easily.
And the president has again and again promised that whoever he picks will be pro-life and will be a strict follower of the Constitution. So we'll just see who it is.
That's right.
Thank you, Matthew Continetti of the Washington Free Beacon. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
And the U.S. says it has a plan for how to dismantle North Korea's nuclear weapons program. The proposal would take roughly 1 year. The White House says it will present it to the communist nation in the near future. Kim Jong-un pledged to end his country's nuclear program at a summit with President Trump, but intelligence reports indicate North Korea may not fully give up its arsenal. And the State Department lays out what it wants from Iran. Spokesman Brian Hook says the country must meet 12 demands to be freed of U.S. sanctions. He adds normal countries don't terrorize other nations and impoverish their own people. U.S. senators meet lawmakers in St. Petersburg, Russia. This comes ahead of a summit this month between Presidents Trump and Vladimir Putin. Relations between the countries are at a low point following claims of Russian interference in the 2016 election. Foreign ministers from Russia and Jordan will meet tomorrow to talk about the crisis in Syria. Jordan's foreign minister says he hopes the talks will stop more destruction and possibly create a ceasefire. Around 270,000 people have escaped the most recent fighting in one Syrian city. Russia backs the Syrian government's offensive. And a 13-year-old Palestinian was killed Friday in a protest along the Gaza Strip. More than 300 people were injured. Thousands flocked to the border with Israel. They burned tires and threw rocks at soldiers. The weekly protest started in late March. The campaign is backed by Hamas, the militant group that rules Gaza. And a suicide bombing Sunday in eastern Afghanistan kills at least 19. The attack targeted Sikhs and Hindus. The Islamic State claims responsibility, saying it went after polytheists. Sikhs and Hindus have been victims of violence in the past, causing many to leave the Muslim-majority country. Those communities had 80,000 members in the 1970s. Today, around 1,000 are left. Catholic bishops warn nearly 800,000 children face starvation. The bishops cry for help for suffering kids in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Rebel-led violence there has led to a skyrocketing of food shortages. And a Western German bishop says he'll allow the Protestant spouses of Catholics to receive communion, at least in individual cases. But Archbishop Hans-Josef Becker adds it's not a general permission. And for more on this story, including the bishop's reasoning, visit our partners at CatholicNewsAgency.com. Pope Francis prays for peace for violence-torn Nicaragua.
per l'amato popolo di Nicaragua.
The Holy Father speaking at his weekly Angelus address at the Vatican. The Pope says he's supporting bishops in mediating the country's divisions. Nicaragua has been rocked by political fighting and violence. Vatican correspondent Juliet Lindley joins us from Rome. Juliet, give us an update. What's happening in Nicaragua?
Jason, more than 180 people have died in recent months in Nicaragua as protesters are seeking to oust the socialist president Daniel Ortega. Now, the violence has practically brought the country to a standstill as police forces are clashing with opposition fighters. And meanwhile, here in Rome, in St. Peter's Square, on Sunday during the Pope's Angelus, you could see banners being held up calling for peace in the country, saying things like SOS Nicaragua, and you could also see pilgrims holding aloft Nicaraguan flags.
I know one of the country's cardinals met with Pope Francis about this whole situation, and I know the bishops are doing having a key role there. What exactly are they doing in Nicaragua?
Well, indeed, Jason, our colleague from EWTN Noticias, a Spanish-speaking colleague, Álvaro de Juana, interviewed Cardinal Leopoldo Brenes here in Rome. And Brenes wanted to make it very clear that the bishops in Nicaragua are not trying to get involved at a political level. He said none of them are trying to get into government and none of them are trying to run for office or create a political party. He said that they had delivered a document to President Ortega in which they were simply trying to reflect the needs and desires of the people. He said the bishops want to simply be witnesses and help in mediation, but not get involved politically. Now, just as a side note, Jason, Cardinal Brenes was in Rome for the consistory last Thursday, which is the ceremony during which Pope Francis created 14 new cardinals last week, 3 of whom come from Latin America, from Bolivia, Peru, and Mexico.
And I know Nicaragua wasn't the only country the Holy Father talked about yesterday. Tell us what other countries did he talk about?
That's right, Jason. He prayed for peace between Eritrea and Ethiopia. As we know, there's been a slight warming in relations between the two countries from the Horn of Africa. And he also turned his attention to the Middle East. And he said that he hoped for the suffering of the Syrian people to let up after all this time. And he also added that on Saturday he will be heading for the southern Italian city of Bari, where, as we know, Jason, the relics of St. Nicholas are preserved. And it is a pilgrimage of peace and unity, where he will be meeting the leaders of the churches and the Christian communities of the Middle East, including, Jason, Patriarch Bartholomew of Constantinople.
In Bari, Italy, I know very well. My great-grandfather came from there, and we have a very strong love and devotion to St. Nicholas. So, Juliet Lindley, thank you so much. EWTN News Nightly's Vatican correspondent. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason.
Coming up, a look at the struggles for Catholics in Myanmar. And Pope Francis talks about the World Cup with a fellow world leader. We're glad to have you with us tonight. I'm Jason Calvi in for Lauren Ashburn. The United Nations Secretary General calls Rohingya refugee stories unimaginable. Antonio Gutierrez visited them today in Bangladesh. He says he heard stories about migrants being murdered and raped, adding they only want justice and a safe trip home. 700,000 Rohingya have crossed the border to Bangladesh. They're escaping violence at the hands of the military. And persecuted Catholics in Myanmar also face growing problems. Myanmar is a Southeast Asian country. Of its 53 million people, only about 1% are Catholic. They're both a religious and an ethnic minority. To talk about this, we're joined by Philippe Nassif, Executive Director of In Defense of Christians. Welcome back.
Thank you for having us.
So what's the situation right now for Catholics in Myanmar?
So right now, the situation for Catholics and Christians across the board in Myanmar is really deteriorating quite rapidly. We have a very extremist Buddhist group that has started to really persecute the Christians on the ground in Myanmar across the board. First, they've been focusing on the Rohingya. They're an ethnic Muslim community in Myanmar that live in the western part of the country that you've all been reporting about. Now we have a Christian community, an ethnic minority, mainly the Kachin ethnicity that's in the northeast part of the country. They're predominantly Christian. Now they're under the gun. Their villages are being burned to the ground. They're being driven out of the country. And we're seeing a lot of reports just in the last couple of months of many of them being killed, and driven from their lands.
It's a really sad story. I know the country's first and only Cardinal Bo, spoke to EWTN News Nightly, and he said that the Catholics in the country are well respected by the majority of Buddhists. It's a Buddhist majority country. How can that help alleviate the problem for the Christians right now?
You know, the issue is, and this is very similar to what we saw happening in other countries around the world. I'll use the Middle East as an example. In Iraq, where you had a lot of Christians with good relations with their Muslim neighbors, but when you have militant extremist groups with weapons, you know, hundreds of men coming into your village, people are scared to stand up to them. So you can only hide a certain number of Christians in your basement or, you know, wherever in your property before they find you. And then they're going to go after the people that are protecting these communities. We're starting to see that happening in Myanmar right now, which is very concerning. We're seeing people sort of turning against these Christian villages. We're seeing neighbors that aren't standing up for them. And if they are, they're getting killed. Because as you can see, it doesn't really matter what religion you are in Myanmar, apparently, whether you're Muslim or you're Christian, whatever, you're getting targeted by these extremist Buddhist groups, and that's the problem.
So sad. And I know last year, I believe Pope Francis visited Myanmar. I'm just wondering how Christians can really help ease this ongoing persecution, if they can do anything at all.
Sure. I mean, I think that Pope Francis visiting sort of shed light on the fact that there are even Christians in Myanmar to begin with.
1% of the population, right?
1% of the population, and they've been there since 1548. I mean, some of the first Portuguese missionaries went to Myanmar and found a population that was very, very much, you know, that loved hearing the gospel, and some of them converted, and these communities have been in existence ever since. So, you know, we have to sort of protect these communities as much as possible. And certainly, you know, the administration here in the United States, members of Congress need to hear more about this issue. Having the Pope visit definitely started that dialogue. Now, unfortunately, with the sad news coming out of Myanmar, their plight has been elevated.
And it's just such a confusing issue because you've also got the persecution of the Rohingya going on as well.
Right.
And, you know, all eyes are on that. And now you're bringing light to the fact that Catholics are being persecuted as well, which is really shocking as well.
Right.
I'm just wondering, you know, as you consider, your organization particularly advocates and has been doing a lot of advocating and lobbying on behalf of the Christians in the Middle East. Now you're focusing on Southeast Asia. I mean, this is a totally new realm for you, right?
It is. Well, we're still focused on the Middle East exclusively, but the thing is that with Myanmar, there are very few people that are talking about the Christian persecution. In particular, we've heard a lot about the Rohingya, that again are a Muslim population in Myanmar, the minority. What's happened to them is horrible. Now we're seeing it happen to the Christians. And there's a real similarity between the small Christian minority in Myanmar and the small Christian minorities we've been advocating for in Iraq, the similarity being that most Americans don't know they exist. And then before you realize it, they've been exterminated and they haven't been helped. So we stepped up to the plate. There's a coalition of faith-based international religious freedom organizations that are coming together to highlight the plight both of the Rohingya and the Christian population in Myanmar, and we're going to make sure that we're there by their side to sort of elevate these issues and come up with some solutions.
Thanks for bringing that to our attention. I appreciate it very much. Philippe Nassif, Executive Director of In Defense of Christians. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Up next, the latest on a boys' soccer team and its coach who've been missing in Thailand for more than a week. And some of Rome's homeless have a meal with Pope Francis. Thanks for joining us. I'm Jason Calvi in for Lauren Ashburn. A soccer team of 12 boys and their coach missing for more than a week in Thailand are found alive. The area's governor says the boys are not out of danger just yet, but the rescue has begun. The news brings hope to a desperate search that attracted international help, including from the U.S. military. The boys are aged 11 to 16. They and their 25-year-old coach disappeared when flooding trapped them in a miles-long cave. Pope Francis meets with Bolivia's President Evo Morales. The Holy See press office says they spoke Saturday about world peace. It was the 6th meeting for the two Latin American leaders. They also chatted about the World Cup. Some of Rome's poor and homeless were served up a special surprise: the Pope. Francis chatted with the group for about 2 hours. The dinner was held in celebration of Cardinal Konrad Krajewski. He's the Pope's almsgiver who was made a cardinal. I'm Jason Calvi, and for the entire EWTN News Nightly team, thanks for watching tonight. We hope to see you tomorrow for more news from a Catholic perspective. Good night, and God bless.